Well, good afternoon and welcome to another ESOP Centre webinar. My name is Ian Harris. I shall be chairing the webinar today, and I am delighted to introduce David Craddock to talk to us all about the employee voice. We wouldn't be here were it not for our members and sponsors, and this is a list of the member sponsors of the ESOP Centre. And here is a list of all the members and sponsors of the FS Club, in which the ESOP Centre is a special interest group. And we're really, really grateful to all of these members and sponsors for making this webinar programme possible. I'm going to give a very short introduction today, and then David will be speaking for about 20 minutes on the employee voice. And we're hoping to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. It's usually one of the most interesting bits of these webinars. And the questions and answers are down to you if you are our live audience today. I know that probably at least half of you will be watching this on catch-up afterwards. But if you are live with us today and want to ask a question, please do so within the GoToWebinar question and answer area. We don't see anything outside this sort of enclosed space in which we operate when the webinars are live. So if you do have questions that you want asked, it needs to come into us through GoTo. David is always very keen to take your questions, and those of you who know him, I think know if you have any questions that arise from outside the webinar time, you can email David with your questions, and I'm sure he'll be delighted to answer them. David, as I'm pretty sure most of you will know, and as I've said before, because I take great pleasure in hosting webinars when David has been presenting many times, David's an independent consultant who specialises in employee share ownership, and really is, we often use this term loosely, but in David's case it is not a loose term, really is one of the world's leading experts on employee share schemes. He's the author of the Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes and many, many other papers on the topic. This particular subject, empowering employees and giving the employees voice, I think will be a very interesting talk today. I asked David to give me one or two facts about him that maybe not all of you would know because it's not there on his CV. And the interesting fact about David that I'm going to give you today, which maybe even some of his friends don't know, is that he has walked all of the major footpaths of England in his time, starting back in the 80s, I believe. And so walking is a big thing for David, but it's not going to be walking right now, it is going to be talking. So without further ado, let me hand over to David Craddock, today's speaker, who is with David Craddock Consultancy Services. There is the information about him on the slides, to talk to you about the employee voice from employee share scheme participants. David, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and always really wonderful to work with you. We've done many of these webinars previously, and this is a really powerful subject indeed, where we're talking about the employee voice, by which we mean, as Ian indicated, the empowerment of the employees to produce for the business and to glean a return, an enhanced return for themselves. So how is the employee voice expressed? I've got two slides on this, so let's just go through it. So first of all, the employee leadership for employee share ownership. So the initiative for the introduction of the employee share ownership project, the employee share scheme, in whatever form it takes, always comes from the company. So although best practice on the implementation is to consult with the employees and generate employee interest, the development of the terms and conditions of the rules, the share option contract, and indeed the supportive communications with the employees is always employer-led. Yet the initiative is generally not one of imposition, but rather of invitation to share with the existing shareholders in the returns of income, dividends, and capital gains. So first point to emphasise the employee-led nature of an employee share scheme introduction. But secondly, the positive motive behind the employees is wealth creation for themselves and wealth creation for the employees. So Louis Kelso, who is the modern day the founder of the modern day ESOP, Palo Alto, California, in 1956 with Peninsula Newspapers, he identified a differential between the growth in the capital value of the company and the growth in pay for the employees, namely that the latter fell considerably below the former. Interestingly, while increasing the latter, the growth trajectory in the pay of the employees, or the employee return through pay and employee share schemes, the same initiative also increases the former. So what we have is a lessening of the differential, but an increase in the wealth value creation for the company as a whole. And this is part of the genius of employee share ownership. I'm always talking about the genius of employee share ownership, but this is one of the features where that genius lies. Furthermore, it's intended to forestall negative employee voice. So what is negative employee voice? Negative employee voice is industrial action, strike action, work to rule, protests and demonstrations. And indeed, when Margaret Thatcher, inspired by the work of the Institute of Economic Affairs, came to power in 1979 and embraced employee share ownership, the savings-related share ownership in particular, savings-related share option scheme, she was in particular seeking to combat the negative employee voice of her day through the very, very dire industrial relations position that she inherited from the previous Labour government. So let's go on to the next slide. This is slide 2 of how the employee voice is expressed. The employee voice becomes effective through a dual expression, what I call the voting voice and what I call the participation voice. So firstly through voting rights attached to the employee shares, and that's the voting voice part of the employee voice. See, clearly, we're always seeking to establish that identity of interest between the shareholders, management, and the wider workforce, and we do that by imitating as closely as possible in our employee share scheme the rights for the employees to be a mirror of the rights for the shareholders, and that's why voting rights should be included. Very often they're suppressed or they're restricted. But my contention is that for a true identity of interest and for a true maximisation of the introduction of the employee share scheme initiative, we want to include voting rights within that bundle of rights which is attached to the shares for the employee share scheme. Remember that it's the employees who will always be in the minority. They will always be in the minority as shareholders. Of course they will. But we should take very, very seriously what they register through their voting rights. Why? Because they are the shop floor, the coal-faced people responsible for output and productivity. So that's the voting rights part of the employee voice, what I call the voting voice. But that's complemented through the participation voice. And so what we need to look at is an holistic understanding of employee voice. Employee voice equals voting voice plus participation voice. And participation voice is where the company embraces the multiple human resource sister policies that support effective employee share schemes. So employee share schemes introduced on its own, can it work its magic? Well, it can do something, but it's going to work a lot more magic if it's combined with compatible sister human resource policies, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. That principle, though, before I just go on to the policies, is supported by many key studies. One of the early ones was the New York Gorham-Winther study in 1987, and then the 1988 study through the US General Accounting Office, which has had some publicity, I know, through US media over the course of these last few days, in the wake of what they might do as a consequence of the US election. The Manchester Metropolitan University study in 1991, which was led by my old friend Andrew Pendleton, on the correlation between training and development in a company and the success of employee share ownership, and my own studies, which when I was working as a manager and then as an executive with Wedgwood from 1985 to 1997, I undertook with the assistance of people from Keele University School of Development Studies. So that was from 1991 to 1992. Let's go on to the next slide, Ian. So on this next slide, I talk about Wedgwood as a case study. Yes? And this was in the 1980s and 1990s, and it illustrates the effectiveness of the participation voice through compatible human resource policies in support of the voting voice. So I introduced a profit-sharing employee share scheme. These are things I've learned in previous incarnations before going to Wedgwood after I graduated from Oxford University in 1978. And indeed, I was first introduced to these ideas whilst I was an undergraduate at Oxford University. And so I introduced a cash profit share scheme followed by a profit-sharing employee share scheme of the type which the so-called Lib-Lap Pact had introduced in the latter years of James Callaghan's government before Margaret Thatcher came to power. Margaret Thatcher, of course, then developed further employee share schemes on the back of that, so that we have this combination of schemes that exist today, augmented, of course, then by the work of Gordon Brown and then by the coalition government. So what I'm wanting to say next in this point 2 is from a football analogy. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of flavour to what I'm saying today. There's a very important coaching principle in football, which says look after the ball and the ball will look after you. Yeah, so learn how to kick the ball and you'll be able to affect your pass much more cleanly. Look after the ball, you'll be able to put the ball in the back of the net, as they say, much more effectively. So the capacity of the employee share scheme to contribute to the output and productivity of the business depends on how the employee share scheme is treated. Is it treated with care? Is it given a profile in the business through meaningful employee communications? And is it supported? So it's just not standing there alone, isolated. Is it supported by compatible participation policies, which I call the sister human resource policies? Employee share, third point on this slide is the employee communication policy, always the lubricant that gives maximum efficiency to the success of those compatible human resource policies. Communication, a key employee benefit, as well as the effective mechanism for making all the other policies work. Through direct communications, cascaded down with the authority of the board of directors through the organisation by suitably trained communicators. Let's go to the next slide. So what I've identified here is, and in fact on the next few slides, are compatible sister human resource policies. One is training and development. To actually give respect to the employees by investing in their training needs, that's going to bring a benefit not just to the employees but to the company as a whole, and indeed in their development. And one of the policies which I was responsible for during my days at Wedgwood was to actually introduce a training and development policy which worked alongside career progression, succession planning, and also contingency planning. Quality circles, that was a policy which was pioneered by one of my colleagues, Christopher Johnson, as of the Johnson Brothers pottery fame, which was part of the Wedgwood group at the time. He saw the idea of a quality circle in the newspaper and developed the idea magnificently for Waterford Wedgwood, where a group of employees come together from a particular discipline or work area. They're the people who know the business best, and so they contribute ideas in order to improve those processes and make them more effective for the business as a whole. Allied to the idea of quality circles, there's suggestion boxes, inviting employees to put their ideas down on a card and put them in a little internal posting box, anonymously if they so wish, but we always encourage them to put their name on the cards if they felt able to do so. Let's go to the next slide. Some more participation voice policies. Fair pay. Always effective company relations with employees are predicated on the perception by the employees that they are paid fairly. Again, one of my responsibilities was to introduce fair pay, and that was done through effective job evaluation, involving employees in the job description writing, and indeed operating a panel drawn from the different parts of the company to confer on the positioning of jobs within the metrics of job evaluation. And indeed involving all the managers in collaborative discussion on the job factors which would reflect the company values, which the company itself had determined through employee involvement. So you can see how this participation factor works in very strong measure. Performance management, again, it was one that I was responsible for, encouraging two-way dialogue between employee and reporting manager, identifying training needs and therefore fitting into the training and development policy, directing aspiration and career development, and empowering the employee. Delegation policy, absolutely crucial to developing the business, empowering your people so that they can take responsibilities, rise up as managers, and manage other people in a powerful and meaningful way that increases output and productivity. And then works committees have identified where a group of representative employees would meet to discuss matters of a more corporate nature in comparison with the quality circles, which is more concerned with business and work processes, the detail thereof. Let's go to the next slide. So the implications of Companies Act 2006. Now look, this is the section which is not very often brought out, but it really is a very, very powerful section indeed, because it identifies that when the directors are deciding upon the actions which are necessary in order to promote the success of the company, it's not just for the benefit of the shareholders or the members of a whole, but also for other persons, including the interests of the company's employees. And so the point is this, that the companies do actually have a statutory duty to take into account the interests of the employees when making decisions to promote the success of the company. And this section, therefore, by implication, a wider definition, a much wider definition of stakeholder to include employees and indeed others, suppliers, the environment, rather than to restrict stakeholder solely to company shareholders. The natural corollary of these implications is, of course, to ensure that the collective voting voice of the employees is heard and recorded by the directors. And although the employees may be minority shareholders, individually and as a group, their voice is significant, as they're the people in the company upon whom the production depends. Let's go to the next slide. So on this next slide, I've just given a little bit of an interlude from the intensity of our modern situation to say, well, what are the lessons we can learn from ancient Greece and indeed from the Judeo-Christian world? So let's just have a look at ancient Greece to start with, the lessons from ancient times, and indeed a very firm lesson on employee voice. Democracy, of course, has its origins in the state of Athens, the city-state, around the 5th century BC. Other parts of ancient Greece actually followed that example, but the lead came from the city-state of Athens. The word democracy, as I'm sure most of you know, is derived from two words, demos, which means people, kratos, which means power. So, hey presto, democracy means people power. Fast forward into the modern era, into 2024, and it is empowerment that is required for the employees within the business. Note, it is not democracy that has been proposed for employee shareholders, and that in itself should take away fears on the part of management in encouraging employee voice in all its many manifestations. Rather, the proposal is to empower employees through participation. So the likeness of the modern day corporate setting to ancient Greece is that the city-state of Athens operated a direct democracy for its relatively small population, not greater than some of our very large combines in the UK today, as those eligible to participate cast their votes directly and with a small electorate were able to exert an influence. Modern day liquid democracy, a subject in its own right, and I promised Mark and Mayanelli that at some point I will do a webinar on liquid democracy, but just a reference to it here, operating through electronics as adapted for the companies, has the capacity to bring that direct democracy in a very meaningful way through the voting power of employees on every issue, as in Athens of old. And then I've said a word about the Judeo-Christian world, a lesson on employee share ownership. In the Old Testament of the Bible, King David promoted the principle of partnership in the first book of Samuel, chapter 20. And on returning from war with the Amalekites, King David ruled, contrary to the wishes of his fighting forces, that the support team at home should also join in the share of the spoils. The warriors didn't want this, but King David insisted. He said, no, everybody has contributed, whether it be the people who supported at home or the warriors out in the field. And so just as with an employee share ownership program, he allowed a share of the proceeds of war to be shared amongst everybody, just as the share of the company's success is shared through the wages of capital, as Louis Kelso called it. We really are mixing the metaphors here, aren't we? Louis Kelso with King David. I always have a particular interest on King David, and I've actually written separately once upon a time an article on King David. You get the connection, King David and David. Not that I'm king, but you know, we do share the same name. Right, let's go to this next slide. Significance of voting rights for the employees. Firstly, a symbol of trust. So yes, we can have all the participation voice policies. Let's get as many in place as possible. But although the employee voice is, to be effective, must go beyond the voting voice to embrace the participation voice, it is the voting voice which is the totem expression, the emblem of the employee voice, the symbol of trust from company to employee. Now, this is really some pretty heavy stuff we're going to get into here, and therefore probably not dwell on it, but just leave it with you to think about. Compliance with the law. Technically, not complying with Section 172, subsection 1 of the Companies Act 2006, constitutes a flagrant disregard of the law, non-compliance, in fact, and that section requires that the directors, when promoting the success of the company, should take into account the interests of the employees. Furthermore, look at the UK Corporate Governance Code, and you find a requirement there, a very, very express requirement for directors to take account of the positions taken by the employees. And look at it this way: if the employees didn't know what if the board of directors didn't know what the employees were thinking, wouldn't that be a risk? It'd be, to use Donald Dumford's phrase, one of the unknown unknowns. Yes, it would, wouldn't it? So it's in the interest, Donald Dumfeld, I meant, sorry. So it is in the interest of the board of directors to know what the employees are thinking, and that's why it's so important to get their views on these issues which go before shareholders, and to register their voting voice as part of the employee votes. But look, when we talk about employee voice, I emphasize throughout the whole of this presentation, it's a combination of voting voice combined with participation voice, the expression of the employees within the business in such a way that it empowers them to produce value, output, productivity, increase their return from the business, and at the same time increase the overall wealth of the business. So to reduce that differential that we can also identify between the rise of the capital value and the rise of the return to employees. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Ian. So just coming into some round-off points now. The corporate benefits of employees, the impact on the corporate mindset. 1, to enfranchise employees to higher levels of personal self-esteem. All psychology reports show, can we go back there, Ian? All psychology reports show that it's personal esteem which provides the enhancement in personal self-esteem, which brings the employees to be empowered to higher levels of personal productivity, to enrich employees to higher levels of prosperity through the wages of capital, dividend returns and capital gains, to embody employees into a sense of belonging and identity with the company. All the research shows that identification with the business for employees is what motivates them and encourages them into contribution, creativity, and entrepreneurship. So operating as a minority shareholders does not in any way undermine the significance of the employee votes, either individually or collectively, given the importance of the workforce to the strength and indeed the survival of the company. Indeed, the testimony of employee ownership is that it operates most successfully when within the context of the private company there is a majority shareholder, and within the context of the quoted company there is the stability of the institutional shareholders. The point being that the employee shareholders, both individually and as a collective whole, they find their orbit better within the stability of having a strong majority shareholder for the private company and strong institutional shareholders, giving stability to the quoted company. Let's go to the next slide. So, right, we're coming through. We've just got 2 more slides to go here. The employee voice is freedom of speech. In the US, we hear a lot about freedom of speech. I go there as regularly as I possibly can to see family and to continue that theme from earlier on, Ian, to walk in the Santa Monica Mountains, which I shall be doing over Christmas and the New Year. So freedom of speech enshrined in the First Amendment, adopted in December 1791 as one of the 10 amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights of the US Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, if the wise men who made up the founding fathers put emphasis on the freedom of speech, and they were very, very wise men indeed, Jefferson, Madison, George Washington himself, Hamilton, many others, Adams, and I think we should give some significant thought to how freedom of speech is best expressed within our nation and indeed within our companies, which is the subject of today's talk. The employee voice contained within the voting voice and the participation voice that constitutes that expression. Any of you are interested in that theme of freedom of expression? Well, it's from freedom of speech and freedom of expression that is derived other key freedoms: freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, freedom of communication, which are the freedoms that have the capacity to realize potential for the business and have the employees operating with an entrepreneurial mindset while employed by the company. I always like to give as many flavors to my subjects that I discuss as possible. Those of you who are interested in this ancient writing activity and indeed more modern day writing, have a look at Thomas Paine, maybe go into the ancients and look at Cicero, a bit more up to date Alex de Tocqueville. They all have wonderful interesting things to John Locke, actually, from the philosophical writings that reply to Descartes, all have fascinating things to say about freedom of speech and all the other freedoms which are associated with it. And this final slide, just to take us into the last couple of minutes, so we've got a few minutes before question time begins. Today's final thoughts on the employee voice. Voting rights for the employees is often the forgotten employee benefit. My great friend Damien Carnell has done lots of wonderful work on this subject. I want to give him credit for that. He did an ESOP Centre meet on that a few years back. Lots of very powerful points he brought out from his research. Properly introduced and communicated to employees, it has the capacity to deliver productivity increases for the company. Companies owned by EOTs are now introducing compatible system human resource policies, saying that they I don't know, founded these things or discovered them. All I would say is we had that far-sighted Wedgwood approach back in the 1980s and 1970s. I depicted in that case study, and they of course fit equally well therefore on the basis of that Wedgwood experience with the direct employee share ownership model that we introduced. I like to introduce, when I introduce an EOT, I like to introduce direct employee share ownership alongside it. Modern technology, I made a reference to, just an oblique reference to liquid democracy. Modern technology facilitates ease of approach to the administration that is required to introduce that corporate form of liquid democracy. And then just these final 2 points: management neglects employee voice at its peril, whether through the voting voice, which will inform management and forestall future problems arising from discontent, or through the participation voice, which has the very, very positive effect, the capacity for significant increases in productivity. The power of the employee voice is, of course, then supported by the lessons of history, the principles of political science and economics, and all that empirical evidence derived from well-executed studies that I've given reference to and which I explain in detail. I think there's a piece on the ESOP Centre website, a piece I wrote years back on the empirical evidence. There's also lots in my book, Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes. So I hope all that has helped you with some appreciation of employee voice. We're now just a couple of minutes or half past Ian. I'm always on time for the questions because I relish them. Let's bring them on. Let's bring them on. Yes, okay.
David, thank you very much indeed, David, for that tour de force and tour de raison of the idea of employee voice and employee empowerment. I found that very interesting. The questions are coming in. We have several, and there's one theme which you and I chatted about actually before the show, and it's coming from one or two different people. How does this concept apply to countries other than the UK? Because you've obviously peppered your talk with history, but you also peppered it quite a lot with UK legislation. And your case studies are the case studies that you quoted are UK corporations. I know that you've done a great deal of work outside the UK. So can you just give us a feel to answer that family of questions around how this might work out outside the UK, on how it works in other cultures and in other jurisdictions?
Well, I think the important thing to recognise about the UK is that it is a very, very compatible regime for employee share ownership. The two leading countries in the world for the introduction of employee share schemes are the UK through the tax-approved tax advantage schemes and the US through their qualifying plans. In the UK, we have strong statutory underpin, not just for the introduction of the employee share scheme, but also for the introduction of employee voice. In the UK, in the US, in Europe, in many countries in the world, we have freedom of speech. And so all this predicates a very, very powerful infrastructure for the introduction of employee share schemes. The point is, though, that these principles, the employee voice, the participation policies, the voting rights, can be replicated in any company in the world, subject to, in certain regimes, there are restrictions on freedom of speech, which is a political point that is pertinent to particular regimes. But I have to say, I've never introduced a scheme into North Korea. I have introduced a scheme into Vietnam very successfully. We've introduced schemes into over 50 countries over the years. I've visited more than 40 of them, 40 countries through this work. In the days pre-Zoom, I was invited to go to all these countries. mainly part of international groups, whether they be quoted companies or private companies, and physically meet with groups of employees. And what a phenomenal privilege that is to have that cultural experience. And I write about it in my books, in my writings, articles. And I have actually done a webinar on it some while back during the middle of the pandemic, I think, Ian. We did one together on employee communication to those multiple cultures. Does that give some flavour of an answer to that question? Hopefully so.
It does. It does. And now to get your brain back into the UK, one or two questions quite specific about the UK. Derek asked, I'll read this question verbatim. It has been said that Section 172 of the 2006 Act disappoints in three ways. There's a deficiency of clear-cut interpretation, there's a lack of remedial action, and an absence of judicial application in the business framework. What are your views on this, and how that might affect the employee voice?
I think Derek is right on all three counts, that there is no enforcement mechanism, but it is written into the legislation, and respect should be given to that legislation. And companies that want to introduce employee share schemes, whoever is the pioneer within the company for the employee share scheme model should bring that section in as tactful and as courteous a way as possible to their board of directors. I mean, the reason why I talk about Wedgwood is because I was there for 12.5 years as a manager and then as an executive before setting up by myself in 1997. I brought ideas from my pre-Wedgwood life to Wedgwood. That I got support of the directors, but I was very much a pioneer. And in those days, 1980s in particular, it was frontier country to introduce employee share schemes. These days, it's the tick box. Have I got my employee share scheme in place? Say the board of directors. How cynical that is. But there is a lot of that. You know, they think it's a technocrat subject, a combination of accounting and IT. You know, how far off the mark can you be? It's a human resource subject. It's a powerful financial subject. It's an holistic subject. And so in those days, I was able to, in the days before Section 172, I was able to muster whatever came to my attention through my reading and correspondence with people in London and in the US to bring to bear my case. Section 172 should be brought to the attention of directors. But Derek is correct that there is no remedial action and that there's no cause for court remedy at all, in fact, if it's not applied.
Question here from Robert, where he's thinking about, you know, not only do we have the Louis Kelso type ESOP model, there's also the employee ownership trust model where the shares are held indirectly. How does this work in terms of employee voice? Does it make a difference, or can the principles that you've espoused about the employee voice be applied in more or less the same way to each or any of these models?
Well, we introduce both. We introduce employee ownership trust as a succession model, typically owning 51% of the shares. So effectively, the existing shareholders sell 100% of their shares to the employee ownership trust, and then we dilute it down to 51, so that 49% of the shareholding can be used for new issue shares linked to direct employee share ownership. So individuals do actually have either direct ownership or a direct share interest through an option type arrangement. But yes, the beauty of the employee ownership trust, of course, is that the class of beneficiaries is the employees. So the trustees of the employee ownership trust, and typically it works through a trustee company operating through its own board of directors, have a responsibility to act in the interest of the beneficiaries, who are the employees. Yes, and this is where, in the modern day context, post 2014, when the EOT legislation was introduced, the type of thing that we did at Wedgwood in the 80s and 90s, which was really far-fetched, you know, far advanced, far-sighted, not far-fetched. It sounds like the Avengers, or doesn't it? No, far-sighted. You know, and we worked as a team. You know, I had wonderful support from Christopher Johnson, the production director, and I supported Christopher as he supported me, and George Stonier, the human resources director. You know, we had enormous support. David Martin, the sales director, we supported each other. So I think that, we were introducing all those things back in the 80s and 90s. It's a wonderful case study. The reason why I refer to it is because it's a wonderful case study, but because when I left, I had permission from the board of directors to use it as a case study. I've worked with many companies since, as you know, Ian, UK, US, those two countries in particular, Ireland, South Africa, and each of them with subsidiaries all over the world, and I've done the same sort of thing. Probably with one company to the extent of what I did with Wedgwood in terms of the participation policies, but Wedgwood is a wonderful case study. Wedgwood then went down a different path some years later, but in those days, we had a wonderful time introducing all these subject areas.
Super. You talked about far-fetched, and it's good that your mind is thinking about matters far-fetched. You imagined yourself for a few moments as King David when you were giving us a little bit of a history. Nick Kozlov, I think, wants you to imagine yourself as Aladdin in the pantomime, because he's giving you 3 wishes in this question. I'll read it verbatim. I'm paraphrasing slightly. David, if you could change 3 things about the UK's employee incentive framework, what would those 3 things be? So he's given you the magic lamp, you've rubbed it, the genie's come out, and you've got 3 wishes. What are those 3 wishes, David?
Oh dear. Well, I don't attribute kingship to myself. I just find King David interesting because he's got the same name as I have, David. I find Saint David interesting because he's got the same name as me. Not that I'm a saint by far. I'm definitely not. But 3 wishes to be Aladdin. My goodness, the magic lamp. I think probably that when you introduce an EOT, you should also be required to introduce direct ownership alongside it. In the model that we introduced, which is 100% purchased by the EOT, diluted down to 51 so that 49% or some sizable proportion can be allocated to direct share ownership. That would be one. I guess another would be to lift the limits on EMI, which is a direct ownership scheme, lift the participation limits so that more companies can be eligible. The fact of the matter is, employee share schemes operate alongside low taxation to create growth. There's a lot of evidence in that. It's consistent with what in economics we call the Laffer curve, the curve which was developed by Art Laffer, which was embraced by Ronald Reagan and subsequently by Donald Trump in his first administration, that the lower the tax, the greater the capacity for a company to grow. And I write about this in various of my articles. So the more we can take employee share schemes out of tax, the greater I think would be their potential to grow the companies. I've got 2, haven't I? I've talked about EOT, I've talked about EMI. What else would I say? Well, the third thing I would say is the EST. Thank you for this remit, Robert, for giving me this remit to rub the magic lamp of Aladdin. What a privilege. Would be to say on what we call the EST. These are the employee share trusts that we operate out of Jersey. To provide many more reliefs to that. The EOT holds shares as a warehouse and does a good effect of that for purposes of business succession and encouragement of localism, preserving local culture, preventing aggressive takeovers, and therefore maintaining employment, which might otherwise be threatened by a takeover. But the EST is very powerful as a mechanism for trading in the shares, using it as a mechanism for buying and selling shares. And Louis Kelso, the modern day originator of the ESOP, that my great friend, life president of the ESOP Centre, Malcolm Hurston, visited back in the mid-80s and came back and formed the ESOP Centre, where we've worked together ever since. Louis Kelso advocated that concept, and that's how intergenerationally he was able to encourage the passage of shares between groups of employees intergenerationally in Peninsula newspapers, which famously own the San Francisco Chronicle. I've operated in California with businesses in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, and they favour that type of approach still. It was set as a wonderful precedent by Louis Kelso. Martin Weitzman, of course, who wrote about the shared economy, he developed some of those themes to give them a wider economic context. There's so much we could do in the UK, which we currently have. So I've talked about EOTs, I've talked about EMI, I've talked about EST. Hopefully I'm giving you lots of ideas to germinate there, and maybe through our good friend Michael Mayanelli and Malcolm Hurston, who have much more access to Whitehall and Westminster than I do, we can get some of those ideas in place.
who knows? Nick Kozlov, who actually came up with that question, it wasn't Robert, it was Nick
Oh,
Kozlov. I
Nick,
think
thank you, Nick. Sorry, Nick.
I said, tipped in a message saying thank you very much. He loved every bit of that response, possibly
Yeah.
even the bit where you responded to Robert rather than to him. But
Sorry,
I'm
thank you,
giving it back to you, Nick. It was a delicious question, and David, thank you. That was a superb answer. We've got room just for one more, and I'd like to sort of end up with this one. I think you've largely answered this question as you've been going along, but Susan was intrigued. Where did the inspiration and ideas for the Wedgwood work back in the 80s come from? I'm going to guess you're going to say it came directly from the from the Louis Kelso experience, but perhaps there are some other inspirations and happenings that inspired that work.
That's a really great question, Susan. Thank you. I think that the answer is practically. I was working very practically to enhance the capacity of the company for productivity and output. I saw that there was a need for policies to be introduced on a whole range of subjects, and so I advocated a policy of profit sharing. I thought that was a very practical way to proceed. I got the support of the directors. I advocated a policy of employee share ownership. I was the youngest member of the Wider Share Ownership Council, which was the predecessor to ProShare. So I'd learned a lot about that concept from them. And when I got to Wedgwood, I was able to encourage the directors to embrace that idea. They did in big measure. And it released a sort of fervor of interest. Other of the directors wanted to do wonderful things, which was released by that culture. I said Christopher Johnson, the production director, very keen on quality circles, introduced through one of his people, Graham Finney. On the sales side, I worked with people there to create effective bonus schemes and incentive schemes for the salespeople. We were able to bring leadership training in for the salespeople, so we could establish meaningful delegations with the people back home supporting the people on the road. So it was always practical. It was always very practical. What's going to work in this company? And we put a lot of effort and long hours into making it work. And the year that the final full year before I left in September 97. In 1996, they had the most successful year ever in terms of net margin in the history of the company. In terms of my original input, when I was at Oxford, I was taught by some fantastic economists who were, I have to say, were very interested because of the history of this was in the 1970s, I have to say. I'm sorry about that. I was at Oxford 1975 to 78. But they were very interested in avoiding an unemployment situation such as arose in the Great Depression in the 1930s. And at the time, of course, there was the spectrum of that. If you can remember, there was rampant unemployment under the Labour government and a concern that it might even worsen. And so their main concern was to avoid unemployment. And I sort of turned it on its head and said, well, yeah, we want to avoid unemployment, but what can we do to maximise the benefits of employment itself, both for the employees and indeed for the companies and the nation as a whole? So I was taught by really good economists. David Soskis was my personal tutor, Peter Oppenheimer, Sir John Collier, one-to-one tutorials. I was taught by David Young on international relations, which really stretched my mind, former private secretary to Henry Kissinger. All that brought out ideas in me, which I then on graduation found myself sort of thinking about and working out in my mind, working out my own position. And then I got a wonderful opportunity when I went to Wedgwood to introduce and found wonderful support.
That's a terrific answer, David. Thank you very much. We're out of time, folks, but I do need to do one or two thank yous and just point you to one or two things before we go. So thank you once again to our sponsor. These are our FS Club sponsors, and these are our ESOP Centre sponsors. All of this detail is on the slides, which are available on the website. I put up a little note to tell you that, just to tell people who are watching on catch up that the slides are available on the Xianen ESOP Centre websites if you want to look through all of the slides. There are other resources for the ESOP Centre as well for you to go to. The ESOP Centre website, we have Newspad coming out regularly. You can see all of that information on the website, and FS Club bulletins, again, all there available for you to subscribe if you're interested in that sort of material. So I thank the sponsors. Thanks to you for coming along and listening. There is more to come in our FS Club program over the next couple of weeks. On Thursday, Age Proof, the new science of living a longer, healthier and wealthier life. That sounds good. So just come along for 45 minutes and you'll learn about all of that. What could possibly go wrong if you do that? If you are interested in the financial services side of the Financial Services Club, then Monday the 25th of November might be for you. T+1 from intent to action. This is about getting transactions through the banking system quicker. Can we get there and get there quick? If you are a fan of me hosting your webinars, you need to wait no longer than Tuesday the 26th next week at 9 o'clock in the morning. I will be hosting the launch of the Smart Centres Index number 10, and that should be a very interesting morning for those of you who are interested in smart centres around the world. And then on Thursday the 5th of December, the London Tea Exchange and the Global Fair Pay Charter. A very interesting general topic for those of you who like that sort of thing. So I've said thank you to the sponsors. I've said thank you to the listeners. It's only beholden on me now to say thank you to David. David, that really was terrific. As always, when you do these things, I think people tend to pop little buttons nowadays on the new go-to system to show their applause and happiness. Or there, and there they are. They're all popping up on the screen for you from people who like to do that. So we're just very grateful to you, David, and we love having you here to do these things. I'm sure we will see you again, and audience, I'm sure we will see you again very soon. So thank you very much to everybody, and goodbye.